Welcome everyone to our webinar this morning on honeybee foraging in Ohio's landscapes. We have Doug Sponsler with us this morning. Doug is a PhD candidate here in the Department of Entomology at Ohio State University. He works with Dr. Reed Johnson, who's been a frequent contributor here on the webinar, and he's going to talk about some of the exciting research that he's been doing. So Doug, I'll turn the floor over to you.
Well, hi folks. Thanks so much for coming today. I have to say I'm really impressed by the number of states represented here. I expected a mostly Ohio audience, and I'm really pleased to see people from all over. So thanks so much for coming out today, and I hope that even though my talk today is really based on research done in Ohio, that you'll find ways to extend the ideas that we talk about to wherever your home state is. Well, that's good. I hope that for those of you who are beekeepers, I hope that this will be of practical importance to you and help you understand your bees better and the landscape that surrounds them. For those of you who are not, I hope this will help you understand the situation beekeepers deal with as they try to make their colonies healthy and productive. And I hope it will also give you an appreciation for the floral landscape of your area and how important that is to pollinators like honeybees. Since you don't actually get to see me today, I thought it would be appropriate to start by introducing myself so that you know who's talking to you. That's me there. So I'm Doug Sponsler. I'm a PhD student at Ohio State University. That's my wife, Molly. And in the bottom left corner, that's my daughter, Ellie. She's really excited about being at the Wayne County Fair. And she's getting to meet a sheep in that picture. She had a really good time. So I was born and raised in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And then I went to Cedarville University in Ohio for my bachelor's degree in biology. I graduated in 2010 and soon after started my graduate research at Ohio State University in 2011. Since starting my PhD program there, my research has gone in a few different directions, but they kind of converge on this idea that the honeybee colony can only be understood when it's understood in its relationship to the surrounding landscape. We can't just focus on the bee, we can't just focus on what's going on inside the box, as it were, but we need to understand the colony as integrated with the land that it is situated in. And that has relevance to foraging and nutrition, and kind of the flip side of foraging and nutrition is toxic exposure. So I've studied both of those facets of honeybee biology. But today I want to talk about the foraging side of the discussion. I'd like to start the talk. I want to just give you an introduction to the basic foraging biology of honeybees. This is something I just love to talk about and take every opportunity to talk about because it's really, I think, indisputably one of the most amazing things in nature. It's the most beautiful aspect of honeybee biology, I think, and I really just can't get enough of talking about it. So I'm going to introduce you to that, and then I want to talk about a project that has been running for a few years now in our lab that has studied honeybee foraging in the rural parts of central Ohio. And for those of you who are from Ohio, you know that's corn, soybean, agricultural land there. Then I want to talk about a study that I did looking at colony success and landscape composition in Ohio. And then finally, I want to talk about the strange case of honeybee foraging in the city. And that's something I'm looking forward to getting to at the end of our talk. But first of all, let's introduce honeybee foraging biology. So for those of you from Ohio, which I thought would be almost all of you, but some of you aren't from Ohio, and you'll have to imagine this maybe a little more difficult, with more difficulty. But for those of you from Ohio, imagine last winter in Ohio. It was the coldest winter, I think, in like 20 or 40 years or something. This is a picture of me radioing for help as my tauntaun froze on my morning commute to work. Fortunately, I survived that occasion. Of course, this is a screenshot from Star Wars Empire Strikes Back. I never miss an opportunity to make such a reference. But this gives you a sense of what last winter felt like for those of us in Ohio. And I see that some of you are from Massachusetts, and I understand your winter was even harder there, so you no doubt know what I mean. All right, so if you're all imagining that, now I want to pose a challenge to you. Imagine that you are the size of a kidney bean, a rather small kidney bean at that. You cannot regulate your body temperature, so your body temperature will equilibrate with whatever the air temperature is around you. You're cold-blooded. You're allowed a small wooden box for shelter. And the challenge is that your 20,000 siblings, and your elderly, though surprisingly sturdy mother, must survive 3 months of brutal winter. Oh, and you're only allowed to go to the bathroom on warm days, which, if this is last winter in Ohio, was pretty much never. I hope that you've picked up on the fact that I'm referring to a honeybee colony here, and I hope you can imagine yourself. I want you to put yourself in that situation and realize the obstacle that honeybees face in trying to overwinter. So what's your plan? How are you going to survive the winter? Well, you can't regulate your own body temperature, but there are strength in numbers, right? So there are 20,000 of you. Maybe if you all cuddle up and shiver, you can keep the air just around you warm enough that you won't freeze all winter long. And that is, in fact, exactly what honeybees do. This is a good picture from Randy Oliver showing a typical winter cluster, is what we call it. All the bees in the colony will pack into a tight ball, and they'll quiver their muscles all winter long, and the heat that generates will amazingly keep the inside of that cluster at least 50 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of what the outside temperature is. And last year in Ohio, we had more than one night that dipped below -30. And keep in mind that bees are also kept in Canada and Russia, and I think even Alaska, where those temperatures are not unusual at all. And any colony that survived last winter stayed at 50 degrees or warmer inside that cluster all winter long. That's an 80-degree difference on that -30 night. That's a lot of energy. That's a lot of heat. How are you going to make all that heat? Well, how did you survive last winter as a human? You went inside your house and you burned something to keep your house warm. You probably burned natural gas or perhaps oil or maybe wood or coal. Honeybees burn honey, as you might expect. It takes about 44 pounds of honey to get a honeybee colony through the winter, and that honey is used to support the metabolism, to provide the energy necessary for them to shake their muscles constantly all winter long to keep that cluster warm. That's a lot of honey. But supposing you made it through the winter, you made it through that winter cluster, you had enough food to shiver your way through. Now you must raise 150,000 children before next winter. I am currently raising one child. The thought of raising many more than that is daunting. You have 150,000 to raise in the next 10 months or so. That's going to take another 154 pounds of nectar that you're going to convert into honey, and about 44 pounds of pollen. And of course, all this assumes that your stores of pollen and or honey are not being harvested by a beekeeper, in which case you would need to produce a considerable amount of surplus if you are going to raise all those young and make it through the winter. So what I'm trying to emphasize here is the sheer volume of honeybee foraging. And we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of pounds of resources that a honeybee colony extracts from its environment each year. And I want to pose the question, how on earth does a honeybee colony do that? How do a bunch of little insects with brains the size of pinheads, with minimal ability to think and communicate, how do they effectively, efficiently forage in their landscape? Well, that is one of the most fascinating and beautiful things in all of nature, and I'm really excited to talk about it today. Before I do that, I want to introduce two people to whom we owe most of our understanding of honeybee foraging today. The first is Karl von Frisch on the left there. He has been dead for some time now. He was an Austrian zoologist in the mid-20th century. And he's famous for, among his discoveries, discerning the honeybee waggle dance, which many of you are probably familiar with. Those of you who are not, we're going to talk about it a little more in a few minutes. But he was the first one to realize that honeybees actually do communicate with one another about the location of the resources that they find in the landscape. And Tom Seeley really kind of took on the mantle of Karl von Frisch and developed that the insights into the dance language into a whole field of honeybee foraging ecology. Really, he calls it the social physiology of the honeybee colony, how honeybees regulate foraging by transmitting information in the hive. So what I'm going to talk about is based largely on the work of these two men. All right, so I want you to imagine a honeybee colony. It's going to be represented by that box in the middle there. And the first thing I want to impress upon you is the scale at which honeybees forage. So it is not unusual for a honeybee colony to forage up to 6 miles from the location of the hive. Now, they very often, most often, forage a lot closer than that, but if what they want is far away, they'll go out and get it, even if it's 6 miles away or more. The farthest that honeybees have been recorded foraging is about 14 kilometers, which I believe works out to being roughly 10 miles. For a honeybee, that's roughly an inch long. That's really an incredible distance. I think people have compared it with a human commuting from like Washington, D.C. to New York on a single foraging trip. To put this in perspective, for those of you from Ohio, this might resonate with you. This is what that radius looks like imposed upon the city of Columbus. So you'll notice that if I had a hive right smack in the middle of Columbus, its foraging range would extend east of Bexley, west of Grandview, north of Upper Arlington, and south all the way to Grove City. That's basically the whole city of Columbus that is within the range of that colony. So within that range, there are resources, right, that are distributed not in a uniform way, but in a patchy way. And there are different kinds of resources, and they occur in different places. And somehow the honeybee colony has to figure out where these things are and how to forage them efficiently. So the different colors here represent different types of flowers, and then the different locations, each flower represents a patch. So I just kind of imagined this landscape in a simplified way to help talk about this. But not only is the landscape very large and heterogeneous in where the resources are, they're distributed in patches, it's also constantly changing. So to help you think about this, let's imagine that this is over the course of one day. Let's imagine that the red flowers are the ones that open in the morning. So at 7 a.m., the red flowers are open. Now it's 9 a.m. and the blue flowers have started to open. Now it's 11. The red flowers have mostly closed. The blue flowers are all open. And now we have the first of the yellow flowers. And then by 1, the red flowers are all gone. Most of the blue flowers are gone, or some of them, and there are mostly just yellow flowers. And then there are only yellow flowers by 3, and only 1 patch of yellow flowers by 5. And this is very typical of the kind of foraging situation honeybee colony experiences, because different flowers offer nectar and pollen at different times of day, and their nectar and pollen can become exhausted through the foraging of honeybees and other bees. So honeybees not only have to deal with a very large landscape, they have to deal with one that's constantly changing, and how do they stay up to date in their foraging? And while the changes within the day are one challenge, the changes throughout the year are even bigger in a sense that they're much more dramatic, because a given plant will only flower for sometimes a week or two. Some will flower longer than that, but the pattern of when things are blooming is extremely dynamic. How do honeybees cope with that and forage efficiently? Well, let's suppose here that this honeybee, get my pointer here, that she finds this resource. She takes kind of the circuitous route. She discovers this yellow flower, and it's really good. It's a really rich nectar source, so she makes a beeline, which I might say that the word beeline comes from the fact that bees, in fact, make a beeline when they return to the hive. She goes back to the hive, and she wants to convince her hive mates that it's a great thing to forage on. Well, let's also point out here that so this out here is the sun, and imagine the sun on the horizon. The flower that this bee foraged is 140 degrees rotated to the east, if you will, from where the sun is. So this is the sun on the horizon, 140 degrees. Here's the flower. All right, so this bee goes back. And this is the discovery of Carl von Frisch. For a long time, it was known that bees dance in the hive, and it was described variously and never really understood. But what he discovered is that the bee will come back and will do this characteristic dance where she'll run in a straight line, wiggling her abdomen very rapidly, and then turn and double back and do it again, and double back and do it again. She'll repeat this for many times, potentially. Now, guess what this angle is between the vertical orientation within the hive and the direction of that straight run. Remember, this bee has in her mind the position of this flower patch relative to the sun. And as you've probably noticed, the angle of her dance relative to vertical in the colony is equal to the angle of the flower relative to the position of the sun on the horizon. Moreover, the rate at which she does this dance, the time it takes her to run this straight portion, is proportional to the distance. So she encodes both the direction and the distance of the resource in this dance, and it is hence called a dance language. It is truly symbolic communication. She also encodes the reward value of this patch by how persistently and how intensely she dances. So for a more rewarding patch, she'll dance longer and with greater enthusiasm, if you will, to communicate to her hive mates what they need to know about this patch to decide whether to forage on it. And, importantly, she also shares nectar with them from this flower that she foraged on. And she has the smell of that flower all over her. So her hive mates know where it is, how far it is, what it smells like, and how good it is. And with that information, they choose whether to forage. Now, what this allows them to do, and this is really the work of Tom Seeley, is this allows the colony to be very responsive to changes in the foraging environment, because over the course of the day, as flowers come into bloom and go out of bloom, honeybees will only dance for the really rewarding flowers. So if a flower isn't quite rewarding yet, or if it has kind of peaked and it's on its way down and it's not rewarding anymore, that flower won't be danced for anymore. But when a new flower comes up and is discovered and is really rewarding, the bees will dance for that and recruit each other to it, and this makes the honeybee colony really responsive in real time to what's going on around it. It can constantly be shifting, even over the course of just hours throughout the day, the foraging patterns of the whole colony, thus foraging efficiently in a very complex and rapidly changing landscape. So that's what Seeley and von Frisch established, but more recently, people have discovered that it's actually even more complicated than that. In fact, there was a lot of controversy surrounding the waggle dance earlier in the 20th century, which has largely been resolved, but the antagonism produced by that produced a lot of critical thinking that resulted in a lot of deeper insights that actually make the dance and the overall communication of honeybees all the more complex and amazing, I think. If you'll allow me the liberty of anthropomorphizing these bees here, it's not always a good practice, but I think if we imagine a conversation among them, it'll get the idea across pretty well. So these bees all have access to the same information, but they're not all going to use it the same way. So let's imagine here that this first bee sees this dance and says, "Oh, yellow flowers, 3 kilometers southwest, I will find them." And that bee will, in fact, go and find them and be very persistent in finding them, even if it takes her several trips. She may fail to find them, come back, watch another dance, go try to find them again. And this could happen several times before she eventually finds that. And that seems really inefficient, right? Shouldn't she have just gone out and found something rather than looking so hard for this one particular thing? But you have to understand that that is what makes the waggle dance work. It is inefficient for individual bees, but if there's no ability to communicate to bees, to cause them to switch resources, to cause them to discover and recruit to new resources, if they are not persistent in doing that, then the colony will not be able to be flexible in its foraging and won't be responsive to its environment. So even though it's inefficient at the level of the individual, it's very efficient at the level of the colony, because now this bee, when she finally does find the flowers that she was recruited to, she's going to recruit the other bees in the colony, and they're going to be able to cooperatively exploit that flower patch. Now, bee number 2 here says, "Oh yeah, I remember those yellow flowers. I actually was foraging on them before, and I know exactly where they are, so I'm just going to go out and find them." So this bee didn't really get any new information, except it got an update saying that that patch of flowers that I was foraging on before is still rewarding, it's still blooming, and it's worth going to revisit again. So maybe this bee stopped foraging because of a rainstorm or because of whatever, and now she goes back out to forage again. This bee says, "Oh, yellow flowers are blooming. I'm going to go look for some." So she ignores the directional information and just from the odor realizes that what we're calling the yellow flower is in bloom and figures, okay, yellow flowers are out there. I'm going to go find some yellow flowers. And finally, this bee says, "Oh, good to know there's food out there in general. It must be a good day to forage. I'm going to go out and see what I can find." And so, and there's one more bee here. So this bee says, "You all are wasting your time talking when you could be foraging." So this is based on a paper by Biesemeyer and DeVry, 2001, where they basically said that there are a lot more types of bees in the colony than we've been crediting thus far. And these bees respond behaviorally to information in different ways, and it takes all of these bees in order to make the colony forage efficiently. Because if all the bees only followed the dance information, the colony would forage too slowly. If none of the bees followed the dance information, the colony would forage too inflexibly. By having a combination of behavioral responses to that information, the colony forages both efficiently and dynamically as the landscape around it changes. Okay, so now what happens? That's the honeybee foraging machine in all its magnificence, and it really is just astoundingly beautiful and complex. Now, what happens when we turn this thing loose in Ohio? Or for those of you in other states, imagine the landscape that you live in and think, how would this foraging machine operate in this context? Well, our lab has been doing a project for 3 years now where we've been studying the pollen foraging of honeybees in central Ohio. So this is it's one half of the foraging equation, because there's the pollen plants and nectar plants are not always the same, but it's still a very deep insight that you can gain through pollen analysis. So basically what we've done is we have a bunch of apiaries around central Ohio. We set up those colonies, and the bees collect the pollen. Then, using a pollen trap, we intercept the pollen, and then we take that pollen sample, and we usually regret having intercepted the pollen, because now we have a very large pile of pollen that we need to do something with. But after we resolve in our minds that we really do need to process this sample, then we sit down, and it takes about 6 hours per sample to sort this pollen. It takes 6 hours to sort about a 10 gram sample of pollen. It's extremely tedious, but the results are pretty awesome. You get these sets of pollen colors. Pollen is just really beautiful. I get so excited by the colors of pollen. It's like you never know what you're going to find when you open up a pollen trap and when you sit down and start looking at those pollen colors. And this is an example of a particularly colorful sample that we had. But we sort that pollen into different types, but then we have to identify them. And to do that, we mount them on microscope slides and compare them to reference slides that we have for local flora. Notice that these are pink. It's not because the pollen is pink, it's because we stain them with a special stain that makes them easier to see under the microscope. But this is, just for example, this is a sugar maple here, and this is apple pollen here. And this gives us a really direct way of observing what honeybees are foraging on. So we found this really interesting progression that I've summarized here, and it's very consistent. We've done this for 3 years now. And the durations of each flower are somewhat variable, but the pattern is really consistent. And I'm going to go into some detail now. I want to point out something that you can probably see visually here, though, that's actually kind of important. Based on this, what time of year seems like the best time of year for honeybee foraging? It's pretty clear, right, that we have this huge stack of things that bloom in the spring. Things get pretty scarce in the summer, and then they pick up again a little in the fall, but it's really just due to goldenrod, and we're going to talk about that coming up here. So here's an overview. In Ohio, the first thing that bees forage on in the spring is the first thing that blooms, except for the weird stuff like skunk cabbage. This is the first thing that blooms in a big way, and that's the maples. And in the early spring, this is pretty much 100% of what bees are bringing in for pollen. For those of you who are beekeepers, I put the colors of these pollen here too, and I don't expect most of you to have the time or energy to set up a microscope and try to identify all this by microscopy, but you might have a pollen trap, and you can identify it by color. So maple pollen tends to have this sort of greenish, grayish, yellowish color, kind of a dirty yellow. And that's what you'll see early in the season. You'll also see some purple dead nettle, and really this is not a huge pollen plant, it's more of a nectar plant, but it's prolific in Ohio, and in any agricultural area, this is like the spring weed that grows in agricultural fields that haven't been herbicided or tilled. And it has this beautiful brick red color that really jumps out at you. I love this pollen because it's easy to sort. This is not easy to sort, as you might expect. This is, and this is what it looks like under the microscope. And then there's ash. We found ash to be important here in Ohio, which is significant, right? Because we're not really going to have much in the way of ash in North America over the next decade. It's probably going to be virtually wiped out, or very nearly so, by the emerald ash borer. So honeybees will have to find something else, I guess. But it's this pretty bright yellow pollen, kind of a strong yellow. And then dandelion is really the spring bonanza. And anyone from Ohio will know this to be true, because when dandelion starts, if you watch your hives, they're all coming in with these little orange beacons on their back legs. Dandelion just has this bright neon orange color that's really unmistakable. And it looks really cool under the microscope, too. It has all these spikes and ridges. Willow is another big one. It has this nice kind of yellow color. The mustards, these are a real pain to identify, but they often have this grayish colored pollen, which is pretty distinctive. And there are a lot of different mustards that are pretty common as agricultural weeds. They can be pretty important for honeybees, and this is still in the spring. When you get to late spring, the next really big one for honeybees are the fruit trees. And I suspect that this is true outside of Ohio, too, because fruit trees are always just a really big source of nectar and pollen, because when a tree blooms, that's a lot of nectar and pollen that it puts out, way more than a similar amount of area from an herbaceous plant. The rosaceous trees, they include like hawthorn and apple and cherry, and they're very diverse, have tons of ornamental cultivars, and it's pretty hard to keep track of them all. They tend to have yellowish pollen, though it really varies quite a lot. And then they have this strongly triangular shape under the microscope. And this is really a huge resource. As dandelion is going down, there's this big switch to fruit trees. So Lonicera, honeysuckle. Now, most of you I'm sure you've all seen honeysuckle. Many of you probably know that it's one of the worst invasive species in North America. It's really pretty ecologically devastating. But honeybees, alas, are not the most ecologically conscious insects. They will quite happily pollinate and collect pollen from honeysuckle. And it's actually probably a really good pollen source for honeybees. Now, certainly don't go out and plant it, and you should take every opportunity to remove it, but it's probably there, and your honeybees are probably foraging on it. Then, hands down, the most important plant in Ohio for honeybees is clover. This may be different in other states, and I'm sure that it is, but in Ohio, there's really no contest. Clover is the big crop for honeybees, and it has this chocolate brown pollen that's really distinctive. And if you open your hive in late spring, early summer, this is what you're going to see, almost exclusively. When honeybees forage on clover, they really forage on clover in a big way. In Ohio, it's the white clover and the hybrid clover that are the most important for nectar, but the red clover is also very important for pollen. So clover will last a long time. On a good year, it can last all the way to frost, really, but usually it starts to wind down in the midsummer, and then there's kind of a gap. You have some sunflowers that bloom during that time, and some asters, and they have this nice spiky pollen. Here's a Jerusalem artichoke here with a bumblebee foraging on it. I actually don't know what the pollen balls look like from these flowers because I haven't sorted them out and identified them yet. I would expect a lot of them to be yellow based on the color of the anthers that I see, but that's not always true. Here's a very common aster that we have that blooms in the summer too. Again, nice spiky pollen, but I don't know what the pollen looks like. And these help fill in the gap, but there's really, they don't quite make up for that bonanza that clover is when it's in bloom. But there's one more big harvest for honeybees in Ohio, and that's the goldenrod. And this starts in late summer into fall, and it'll bloom until frost. And man, goldenrod just blooms in these big, dense patches, and honeybees forage so heavily on it. For the last several weeks of foraging, they're bringing in almost nothing but goldenrod because there's very little else blooming. But goldenrod blooms strong and extensively. And I think that if there's anything that's almost as important as clover, it's the goldenrod in Ohio, because it gets the bees well stocked going into winter. So that's what we found about pollen foraging in our bees in rural central Ohio, and I suspect that those patterns hold for much of the Midwest and maybe elsewhere. But when I first started my program, I had other thoughts in my mind. I was very interested in the topic of urban ecology, and as I was looking around and exploring honeybee biology, I discovered that something of a media frenzy was going on with the topic of urban beekeeping, and I'm sure some of you probably are urban beekeepers. And this reached the zenith of its popularity around 2010, I think, when New York City legalized beekeeping, and there were already thousands of beekeepers in New York City, but they were could be openly beekeepers after that. And during this all this discussion, this opinion arose that urban areas should not only be legal to keep bees in, but they are in fact the best places to keep bees. And the gist of it is summarized pretty well by this guy from London, talking about London beekeeping. He says that here in the city, you have the city center parks, wildflowers, railways, commons, and whatnot. In the countryside, though, you have monocrops, pesticides, and herbicides. And I want to emphasize the pesticides are kind of another topic, but the gist of it here is that cities have this kind of diverse floral environment, whereas countrysides have a bunch of monocultures of corn and soybean and wheat and stuff, and herbicides kill all the stuff that honeybees would forage on. Well, that sounds like a reasonable hypothesis. It'd be worth exploring. So what I did was I gathered volunteer beekeepers from Ohio to keep track of new colonies that they started and report the location of their colonies. And I analyzed the landscape around these colonies and then looked for correlations with the success of those colonies over their first year. So I did what's called a principal components analysis that basically breaks down the Ohio landscape into two axes of variation, if you will. So on this horizontal axis, we have urban over here and rural over here. And then on this vertical axis, we have forested rural and cropland rural. So basically, these two axes describe pretty much any site you can pick in Ohio. So what I found was that, surprisingly, the strongest relationship was that both food and wax responded negatively along that vertical axis, and which meant that cropland hives, on average, did better than forested hives. So that is to say, hives in intensive agricultural areas did better than hives in somewhat natural areas. And when I specifically compared cropland to urban areas, I found a similar relationship, that there was quite a lot of variation, of course, as you can see from the scatter plot here, but the relationship was significant and negative. Which was a little puzzling. What could explain that? Why is this the opposite of what people are predicting with what it seems are very good reasons? Well, hold that thought, hold that question. I want to talk about another project that I did that ultimately provided what I think is now the answer to that question. So in parallel to this project, I also set up 4 apiaries in central Ohio. This is downtown Columbus, Ohio, right here. So this is Site A, right in downtown Columbus, Ohio. It's right on top of a parking garage on the main campus of Ohio State University. So this is about as urban of an urban hive as you could get. This is residential Columbus in Clintonville. And then this site here is right on the edge, and I picked that for a reason. These bees had the option of foraging either in the city or in this countryside here. And then finally, this site out here was way out in the farmland of Madison County. And I wanted to know, well, what are honeybees foraging on? So I took the tools that we've been using for pollen analysis from our other project in central Ohio, and I applied them to the question of what do honeybees forage on in these different landscapes. So here's my downtown Columbus hive. That's what it looks like from the rooftop that it's on. Here's my residential Columbus hive. Now, this just happens to be in the backyard of a professor at OSU who's a botany professor and has like this sort of micro prairie restoration project going on in his backyard. So this may be a somewhat atypical residential backyard, but it captures the idea of diverse garden flora. This is the site right on the edge. It was actually at a cemetery. And then here's my rural site right next to a cornfield on one side, and behind this you can't see is a soybean field. I did this for 2 years. And I am still processing this pollen because I have hundreds of hours worth of pollen sorting to do, and that's why I'm glad I still have some time left before I graduate. But I actually did a preliminary version of this project with smaller samples with a high school class that I was helping to teach last year, and we found this really interesting pattern that I just can't stop thinking about, and I'm really excited to explore. So what we found was that in our rural colonies, during most of the year, now I did this during the summer, so we skipped the spring stuff. Starting in the early summer, we got almost exclusively clover being foraged by these rural colonies. Now these samples that you see here, A and B and C and D, A and B were collected on the same day, and C and D were collected on the same day. A on this side from the rural colonies, on this side from the urban colonies. you'll notice that the rural colonies collected almost 100% clover and 100% goldenrod, respectively, depending on the time of year. The urban colonies collected very little clover and very little goldenrod, and collected a whole lot of, I have no idea what. There are easily like 15 different pollen types here, and very little of it is clover or goldenrod, and there's clearly something radically different going on between these two locations. Now, you might think that this was just the observation of that London beekeeper being borne out, that there's poor floral diversity in the rural areas, there's good floral diversity in the city, hence there's good pollen diversity in the city, and poor pollen diversity in the agricultural land. Well, that would be a good explanation, except for the fact that I happen to know something about these landscapes that I put my rural hives in, and both that edge hive and the one way out in the farmland had really rich, like, nature center restoration areas well within foraging distance. In one case, it was literally adjacent to the colony, and that cemetery hive had a wetland prairie restoration area right next to it that had a lot of different flowers blooming in it all summer long. And the hive here in Madison County had a prairie restoration project at a nature center about a kilometer away. So they had access to very diverse pollen, but nevertheless, they chose to forage on clover and goldenrod. The rural colonies, I don't know what they had access to because I can't really florally survey a city, but I know that they chose to forage on a diversity of things. So how would you explain that? If the rural colonies had the option of diversity and they chose to forage, for whatever reason, just on clover and goldenrod, and we don't know what the options were for the urban hive, but they foraged on a lot of stuff that wasn't clover and goldenrod, I think that the best explanation for that is they didn't have clover and goldenrod to forage on. And so they resorted to these secondary sources because the primary sources were not there. Remember, honeybees forage cooperatively, right? They're not independently surveying their landscape. They're telling each other where the best resources are so that they can all go and get it. And in what kind of situation would that work best? In a city, you have lots of little small patches spread very densely and evenly all through the city in little gardens and green spaces, but those are really hard to find. And chances are there aren't many that are like super good patches, that are much better than all the other patches. They're all a bunch of very small patches that honeybees have to go out and find, whereas in the rural areas, you have these big, highly rewarding clover and goldenrod patches that honeybees, through their recruitment system, can forage really efficiently. And my hypothesis is that the biology of the honeybee colony is such that what it benefits from, what it's built to forage on, are not a diverse set of floral resources, but on a few key floral resources that it can exploit with very high efficiency through its cooperative foraging biology. This would explain why I saw the pattern that it was in the agricultural areas, the cropland areas, that honeybees had the highest success in Ohio, rather than in the urban areas, because despite the fact that they evidently forage on a more diverse set of pollen here, that's not necessarily what makes for honeybee success. What makes for honeybee success is having a lot of something that they can forage very efficiently. So, while it is true that countrysides are full of monocultures, herbicides, and insecticides, they're full of something else too, and you can see it very clearly here. This is typical of roadsides in central Ohio, and it's probably typical of roadsides in many parts of the country. They're full of dandelions in the spring, and later on that turns to clover in the late spring and summer. And then toward the end of the year, in all the old fields and the conservation reserve strips and stuff, you have goldenrod blooming just prolifically. And so what the agricultural landscape does is it causes that ecological disturbance that opens up these open spaces for these weeds, that we call them weeds, to bloom, but it is precisely those weeds that provide the rich honeybee forage that enables honeybees to really flourish in these agricultural environments. So whereas in a forested area, these are going to be shaded out. There's a tree canopy. You're not going to get these prolific weeds blooming. And after the trees are done blooming in the early spring, that's going to be a pretty sparse place to forage for most of the year. And in a city, these are considered weeds, and people spray weeds, and they mow them. And even if you have large patches of clover, like we do on Ohio State's main campus, it gets mowed every week. And so the flowers are constantly getting cut off before the bees really get to build up a good foraging force on them. So I think that explains why, at least in our circumstances in Ohio, while there may be many things to commend urban beekeeping, I don't think that the urban landscape is superior to this intensive agricultural landscape, and it's because it's precisely the weeds that show up in agricultural areas that are supporting honeybees. So what I think this honeybee would say in response to this suggestion, this urban advantage hypothesis, if you will, is, well, that's all very good. Thanks for the wildflowers, but all we really want is a lot more clover. We just like clover. I think that's just how honeybees are. That's their biology. And I'll be careful to say this is probably not true of other bees. Honeybees have very large colonies. They need a huge amount of resources, and they forage cooperatively by sharing information. So they're the ones that are going to benefit from these big patches that they can say, hey, there's a huge patch of clover over here, let's all get it. Something like a bumblebee that does not forage cooperatively and will often switch between different flowers on a single foraging trip, those would be more likely to forage efficiently, I think, in an urban landscape. And of course, there are the thousands of solitary bee species in the world, hundreds in Ohio and in all the states of the U.S., I think. Those bees are the ones who are going to benefit from floral diversity. And that is one of the many good reasons why we should support floral diversity. But the data suggest that honeybees, perhaps encouragingly, are able to make it and indeed thrive in a landscape that has been heavily modified by human land use for agriculture. So the conclusions are honeybee success in Ohio appears to be driven primarily by a few key flora and not by something like floral diversity in general. So these flora include things like dandelion, like fruit trees, like clover, and like goldenrod. And it is actually in the agricultural landscapes that most of these plants really flourish and provide the largest and most sustained nutrition for honeybees. The urban environment remains a mystery, really. I have no idea what these bees are foraging on, and honestly, it's going to take me a very long time to figure out. So my hope is over the next year to get some insight into this. But so on the one hand, this is an interesting mystery. On the other hand, it says that maybe we have a problem in the city, and I don't think it's very hard to make the case that we do. That we kill the very weeds that provide the most forage for honeybees and for many other pollinators. So I think if there's one thing that we can do to make urban beekeeping a profitable enterprise, it's to plow up our front lawns and plant goldenrod, plant clover. By all means, if you can get away with that in terms of zoning requirements, please do it and encourage your neighbors to do the same. But it's also encouraging to know that even in the intensive agricultural landscapes, that honeybees can flourish. And that says that agronomy and apiculture, which are so frequently pitted against each other in the popular discussion, are not necessarily at odds, that it is, in fact, the agricultural landscape that is perhaps uniquely suited to supporting honeybees, as long as we respect the boundaries of fields and maintain those gaps between fields and let these weeds flourish in them. I want to acknowledge our lab members here. This is everybody, my advisor, Reed, especially, and some of our funding agencies. I especially want to thank the Ohio State beekeepers. As far as my personal research, it's really been the OSBA that has most consistently funded my projects and indeed participated in them, especially in my citizen science project. So I'd be happy at this time to take any questions. Thanks, Denise.
All right, great. Thanks, Doug, for a really interesting talk. I love all the pollen colors, and I just imagine you there under the microscope trying to pry all these things apart. Bill is asking how well honeybees forage in wooded areas.
I wish I knew the answer to that question. The wooded areas in Ohio are actually the only type of landscape in Ohio that we've not collected pollen from. I know what I would expect, and I know what I've read. So I think that one of the big honey crops in Ohio in wooded areas is tulip poplar, and it blooms and creates a lot of nectar in mid-spring. What I'd expect in wooded areas is that you'd have a really strong spring when you have all these trees flowering, but that you'd have a pretty weak nectar flow in the summer because you don't have those large clover patches. And then depending on whether you have a lot of open areas in your forest, like in open cleared areas in a forest, you'd probably get lots of goldenrod, and that would be a good fall crop. But if it's dense forest, honestly, this is not a good place for honeybees to forage. And that's why when people do feeder experiments where they're training honeybees to a feeder, they always do it in a dense forest because it's easy to get bees to go to an artificial source when there's not much natural stuff around.
Hey, Alan asked about the 6 mile radius that you talked about. Does that consist of all flatland, or what about hilly areas?
Oh, that's really interesting. So honeybees measure distance by what they call optic flow. So basically, they're perceiving the rate at which the pattern goes by, kind of like when you're driving by in a car and you see the landscape kind of speeding by beside you. Honeybees their brains track that and measure distance by how it looks when they're flying. So they actually measure distance differently depending on the texture of the landscape. And if you had a really like hilly or mountainous landscape, I don't know how that would affect foraging. I would think, in principle, honeybees ought to be able to fly over just about any obstacle besides a mountain. So I think they would be pretty tolerant of like the kind of hills that we have in Pennsylvania and Ohio, but that could be a very different situation if you're out in like Wyoming, where my wife is from.
Hey, Mike asked if, do you think it still makes sense to guess that a more diverse diet is beneficial for the colony health?
Yeah, that's so. If we go back to this slide, go back here. So this is what honeybees chose to forage on. That does not necessarily mean that this is what was best for honeybees to forage on. So their biology could be working against them in these really monofloral kind of environments. There is evidence that, in general, a polyfloral diet is better than a monofloral diet. However, the literature on honeybee nutrition is kind of incoherent, and we frankly don't have a very good sense what honeybee nutrition even means, especially from a pollen perspective. Everything else held equal, it's probably better to have more types of pollen than fewer, but I suspect that what matters more is having plenty of pollen. So I don't know. I am doing some nutritional analysis on these, but the trouble is I'm not quite sure what to analyze. I can analyze the protein, but protein, people always talk about protein when they talk about pollen nutrition, but protein might not be the limiting nutrient, right? Like if your car is not running because the engine is broken down, then adding gas to it is not going to help the situation. It could be that protein is just not limiting, and having more protein is just waste protein. So I don't know. But clearly, the honeybee biology is not built to attain diverse foraging. It's built to attain efficient foraging. That's for better or worse.
Okay, and Doug, finally, Natalie asked how important vegetable gardens are to honeybees.
I suspect honeybees are more important to vegetable gardens than vegetable gardens are to honeybees, and the reason for that is just that the volume of resources that honeybees need just so far exceeds what a garden could ever offer. Now, it's good to plant gardens, and collectively, if you have lots of people planting gardens, then that will, on the whole, make a very large amount of resources. But it's going to be good for honeybees in that it provides food that they wouldn't otherwise have, but it's not going to be the game changer, I don't think. However, having honeybees foraging on your vegetables may be a game changer for your vegetable productivity.